Good afternoon. On the table today I've got a brand new in box Saito FA-120 engine. Now there's a lot of things about this engine I think are quite curious, and I really want to try and share those things with you and give you some information on this particular engine. Now, as you can see, this is a box that dates back to the early 80s, maybe to the end of the 80s. Saito boxes, at least in North America, changed colors and things like that. Basically, the colors of the boxes changed throughout the decades. Like in the early 80s, they were this color, a dark blue. Some had yellow writing on them, the smaller displacement ones. And then this is an example of one from probably the early to through the end of the 80s. And then in the 90s, when I was really big into the hobby, all of the boxes that were sold in North America were the black and gold boxes. And then sometime in the early 2000s, they went to all these white boxes. So when you look at the box of an engine, you can kind of get an idea of its vintage in a way. This particular engine is very interesting because I've had one other Saito 120 box like this, an engine like this before. And it looked like what you're seeing on the screen now. It said FA-120S on it. And it also had a dual plug logo on it right here. It said dual plug. Now, as you can see with this particular engine, it's the exact same box, but they've got a white decal covering the S, which tells me that they had a lot of these boxes on hand and they would just modify them like this to denote the type of engine they are. So suffice it to say, when I first saw this, I thought it was going to be the original Saito 120 fathead is what I call them, because they're very large heads, and as you can see in this picture, they look very different than the more modern, smaller head versions of the Saito engines. But that is not what's in here. So let's open this box up and let me show you what I'm talking about. So as we open this box up, now I've been inside this box already, so things have been kind of moved around a bit. This box came with some various paperwork, but it also came with an engine mount, which was not something normally that came with Saito engines, and it's not a Saito mount anyway. It's a Tatone mount, but that's not what's important here. So let me take this engine out and the accessories, because they're going to tell quite a bit of the story of this engine. So if you look here on the table, these are the accessories that came with this engine. When I looked at these accessories, I was like, that's a fathead, because these are the things that came with the fathead engines. At least that's what this is. I've never seen a modern Saito FA-120S that had just this exhaust header like this. Every Saito engine I've seen 120 size that had this header was the fathead version of the engine. But as you're going to see in a moment, that's not what I have here. Again, maybe all these tools, Saito used to put a lot of tools and stuff in their engines, so these are not what is of interest to me. It was this header and then this engine. Look at this engine. I'm going to put a picture up here that shows my 120 dual plug, Saito 120S dual plug next to a 120 original fathead. And you can see there's a huge difference in the way those two engines look as far as the head goes. And if you look really closely, you'll see that the 120S that came in that box also had a very, very different carburetor and intake manifold. As you can see in this one, this has the original carburetor that was put on the 120 fathead, I'll call it, which is, it has an air bleed and it's a 3 adjustment carb. High speed needle, a mid-range disc adjustment, and then of course the air bleed for low speed. Now, that 120S, from a Saito site I found, that engine was produced, I think they said, I'll put an image up here, but I think it was 1983 to 2007. Well, in 1983, that particular engine that was using this box, so the box has already been established as a box from the 80s, had an intake manifold that was a press-in with two O-rings as opposed to being a screw-in one. Now all of the later model Saitos, the very first one, and then all of the subsequent later model ones from after that curved manifold went back to this same type of screw-in intake manifold. So that's what makes this interesting. Not only is this head a smaller head, and the side also just says FA-120. It doesn't say S on it. Not only that, but this is just an interesting engine. I've never seen a combination of the small head with this particular carb arrangement on there, and especially not with this exhaust manifold. The original owner of this engine said he purchased it in 1989 from the WRAM show in New York, from, I think it was America's Hobby Center. And I've got the original receipt that he provided that I'm going to put up right here also. The thing is, he said that he bought this in 1989, which could make sense. However, that receipt from America's Hobby Center, if you look closely at it, it says celebrating our 60th year. And then if you also look at the handwritten and our 60th year, so that would put it in, and I think they started America's Hobby Center in 1931, so their 60th year would put it in 1991, not 1989. But if you look at the handwritten date on the receipt, it also says 2/22/9. It doesn't say 89, and it doesn't say 90 or 91, it just says 9, so they didn't even really complete the date on there. So I'm not sure if the gentleman actually bought this in 1989 or not, because if so, why would they have already had receipts that said celebrating our 60th year prior to it being their 60th year? So I'm trying to piece together the origins of this engine. The box we already know was produced and made and manufactured and shipped with a lot of engines throughout the 80s. So I guess the box is kind of outside the question here. The original Fathead, as close as I can figure, came out in probably the early 80s. But the review article doesn't really state the date because it's from RC Modeler, and seldom does, even RC Modeler in the older days didn't even have the date on the bottom of the article, so it's very hard to tell when the date was, unless Clarence Lee, back in the very first paragraph or so, says relates to another engine in September of this year or whatever, and he says a date. Otherwise you really don't know. So I think the original Fathead came out maybe 80, 81. I'm not really sure. But it's interesting that original Fathead, and if you look very closely at the review article image, the one that Clarence Lee had actually had a very different intake manifold than even what this one has. It had more of one look, an OS, where it screwed on with two screws in the intake manifold and used a gasket. So even that 120 Fathead was different than the other two that I've had in the pictures I've already shown you. Now the funny thing is, obviously I'm always interested in trying to come up with the historical timeline of when engine changes and developments came out and stuff like that. But it's interesting to me that this particular engine still was utilizing this carb when I'm pretty sure that by the late 80s, the Fathead, the original Fathead, was probably already replaced by the 120, this one, and the 120S. So I'm wondering if this was just extra parts they had on hand that they were using to fill orders, because I've never seen a small head 120 that incorporated that type of carb ever before, and this is all a new in box package. So it looks like in addition to just the natural evolution of changes of Saito engines, maybe they mixed and matched some parts too along the way. Now there is not a Saito 120S or any other review articles I could find with other pictures to substantiate any of these things. All I can say is that the other two, I think I've had a total of 3 120s, or 4 of them. 2 Fatheads, and I believe I had 2 of the 120S's. I'll have to go back and look. But I know two of the 120s I had that nice curved manifold. And if you look at more modern white box 120s, they have a manifold like this, but not this carb. So it's just interesting to me trying to figure out, and especially if they did away with this exhaust header a long time ago. So to me it looks like this is an engine that was kind of put together with a variety of parts that were just kind of left over, namely the carb and this exhaust header. And I think that's kind of interesting. But it is a new in the box engine. This engine has never been run. It has passed the sniff test, and it even comes stock with the choke mechanism also, which I think later versions of the Saito 120S and 120 went away from the choke, and they had a Venturi, as you can see in one of those pictures I had already posted also. So this is just a very interesting iteration of a Saito engine that I was trying to figure out what are the origins, what's the actual date of manufacture or purchase, because there are questions now about that with the contradictions in the story and what the actual receipt says, and then of course the incomplete handwritten date kind of makes you wonder what was going on with that also. But anyway, that's a piece of Saito history that I wanted to share with you, and thank you all for watching.